In this section of the course, we're going to be creating an input form using HTML. A form is used to gather input from your user. Forms are the most common method of data collection from website visitors. The data that is inputted into the form can be stored into a database or submitted to an email address. Keep in mind that in order for a form to work and transmit data, we need to use a programming language that communicates with our web server. Later in this course, we'll be exploring PHP and working more with data processing. For now, in the HTML section of this course, we'll only be creating the front end of the form. This is what the user sees through their web browser. Let's take a look at an example of a basic contact form on the web. On this form, the user is able to submit an inquiry directly to the website's support staff by completing the required fields, for example, name, email, subject, and message. If we try to submit the form without filling in any information, we can see a number of errors appear. This is known as form validation. Now let's explore how a form is processed once the user clicks the send button. First, the user completes the form and fills out all the form fields. Next, the data is transmitted to a PHP script which validates the form. Validation includes checking to make sure the data is accurate to a certain degree. Data validation is very important and can be done in client-side programming languages such as JavaScript, and also in server-side languages such as PHP. It's recommended that both are implemented. Keep in mind that users can disable client-side validation by adjusting settings in their web browser. Server-side validation, on the other hand, cannot be avoided. We'll be working with both types of validation techniques later in this course. Examples of data validation types include checking email address formats, checking the length of data typed into a field, for example, a minimum amount of characters or a maximum amount of characters must be met in order for form submission, or perhaps checking the format of a phone number. This is not an exhaustive list, and there are many different ways data can be validated. Once the data is validated, the data is processed. The data can be inputted into a database, it can be transmitted to an email address, or some other form of data processing. On the other hand, if validation fails, the user is typically sent back to the contact form page so corrections can be made. As a reminder, we'll be working with form data processing later in this course. For now, we'll begin with developing just the front end of the form using HTML. In this lecture, we'll be creating an HTML form. This is a sample of the form we'll be creating. It's an employment application form. It asks the user for some personal information. The form consists of text fields, select menus, checkboxes, radio buttons, text areas, and the submit and reset button. The form inputs and input labels are organized into a table. So let's get started. You'll need to open the form.html file in the downloads folder corresponding to this lecture. With the form.html file open, you'll notice that the basic page structure is already set up. The HTML code also contains a table with 2 columns and 9 rows in the body. We'll use this table for our form fields. Let's preview the file just to make sure our table is visible and there are no errors in the code. This is what your page should look like initially. Just an empty table with our 2 columns and 9 rows. The first thing we need to do to create our form is insert our open and close form tags. These tags will contain all the HTML code pertaining to our form fields, such as text inputs, select menus, submission buttons, and other form elements. It's very important to create the form tags first, otherwise the form will not work. The form tags must encompass the entire table because all our form fields will be contained within the table. The form tag also has important attributes that we must define. First, it's a good practice to name the form, so that if you create multiple forms on the same page, each can be distinguished from one another. We'll name this form Employment. Next, we need to instruct our browser on where to send this form data upon submission. This is known as the form action. In our case, we'll be sending the data to a PHP script, which will instruct our web server on how the data should be processed. For the form action, let's type in send.php. We will create send.php in the PHP section of this course. In addition to the action attribute, we must also specify a method of data transmission. A form method tells the browser to submit the data through the post or get command. For now, we'll define the method as post. We'll explore both these methods in more detail in the next lecture. In this lesson, we'll conduct a quick overview of the difference between the post and get method of transmitting form data. This topic will be explained in much more detail in the PHP section of the course. As we mentioned earlier in the course, the HTTP protocol facilitates communication between our web browser and server. There are 2 types of methods that can be used to transmit data between a client and a server. This includes the get and post method. The get method requests data from a specified resource. The post method submits data to be processed to a specified resource. When using the get method, the name and value pairs from the form fields are sent in the URL string, as shown in this example. Here, we can see the values contained in the fname and lname field are attached to the end of the file name of our form action, send.php. The post method, on the other hand, sends the name and value pairs in the HTTP message body, as shown in this example. Both the post and get method have unique properties that are specific to each one. We'll start with the get method. Get requests can be cached, they remain in the browser history, they should only be used to retrieve data, they have length restrictions, they should never be used when transmitting sensitive data such as passwords, and they can be bookmarked. The post method, on the other hand, has no restrictions on data length, cannot be bookmarked, does not remain in browser history, and the requests are never cached. With our form created, we can now start inserting our input fields. Let's start by entering our form heading, followed by our form labels for the 2 input fields. In the first row and first column, we'll enter employment application. In the second row and first column, we'll enter the label for the first input field, first name. And in the third row of the first column, last name. With the labels entered, we can now start putting in our fields. The first name field will require a basic text input field. The HTML code for an input field is as follows. It does require a closing tag. The input field also allows different attributes. First, we need to assign a name. This will be important later in the course when we make this script functional and transmit the data to our PHP script. Your name should correspond to the field label. So we'll just abbreviate first name and we'll call it fname. Try to avoid capital letters, special characters in the name, because that will cause complications later on when we attach this form to our PHP script and retrieve the data from these form fields. So just keep the names lowercase and as simple as possible. Next, we can assign a max length attribute to make sure the user cannot type in more than a certain amount of characters. So for example, say most first names wouldn't exceed 50 characters. So that's how we would prevent more than 50 characters from being typed into the input field. And that's it for the first text input. Now let's copy this block of code and paste it into this column for the last name. So we'll change the name to lname. And that's it. Let's go ahead and save the file and make sure that our first two form fields are visible. So that's what that should look like up to this point. We have the form labels, first name and last name. We have the title of the form, employment application, and we have our first two text input fields. For the position, we'll need to allow the user to select from a menu of different options. As you can see here, the drop-down menu has 4 options that the user can select from: accountant, receptionist, administrator, and supervisor. Let's start with entering our input label. This is in the third row, first column, and in the third row, second column, we can create our select field. And to do that, we'll be using the select tags. I'll just do a bit of formatting. We need to give our select tags a name, just like we did for the input fields. This attribute is important. We'll call it position. Now we can create our select menu options. Each option should be contained within an option tag. So let's go ahead and create 4 options, just the tags for now. And I'll just copy and paste that 3 more times. Now with our option tags created, let's enter the option that the user will see in the drop-down menu. The option tag also requires a value attribute. This attribute identifies the value that will be attached to each option. Let's say, for example, that the user's inputs will be stored into a database that only allows 2 characters to identify which option the user selected. In this case, the user will see the option headings in full: accountant, receptionist, administrator, and supervisor, but the values that get passed onto the PHP script will only be the first 2 letters of each option. So to set the value attribute, we just type in value equals, and because the database can only store 2 characters, we'll use the first 2 characters of each option. And that completes the first select menu. We'll create the second one in the same way. So here's our next table row. We'll insert the field label, which is experience level. And we'll copy this select menu and paste it into this column. We'll call this experience, and we'll just change the options. And it looks like we don't need the 4th option, so I'll just go ahead and delete that. And we'll also change the values that get submitted to our PHP script. So entry level, and very experienced. Let's go ahead and save our file and preview it in our web browser. So that's what we have so far. There's the first select menu we created, and here's the second. Next, we need to allow the user to indicate the job type they are searching for. Whether it's full-time, part-time, contract, or a combination of each. To do this, we'll be using checkboxes. To create a checkbox, let's go ahead and type the following code. Again, we'll start by entering our label. The checkbox is an input, but for type, we have to specify checkbox. We need to give this input a name, just like all the other inputs we've worked with. And we'll call it FT, short for full time. Now we'll close the input tag. And we'll just put full time text next to the checkbox, so the user knows which option they're selecting. And that's all there is to it. We just need 2 more of these because we have 3 checkboxes. So I'll just copy that entire block of code. I'll rename this to PT. Change the label to part-time. And 1 more. This is CT for contract. So that's it for job type. Next, we'll do employment status. And employment status, the inputs are different than job type in that they're radio buttons. The key difference between checkboxes and radio buttons is that checkboxes allow you to check off multiple options. With the radio button, we only want the user to be able to select one option. So let's go ahead and enter our label, which is employment status. And then inside of our column, we'll create an input. This time the type will specify radio. The name, we'll call it E-status, short for employment status. And the value, this is the value that will be submitted to our PHP script. Then we'll close the input and we'll just put the text employed next to our radio button. So once again, the user does know which option they're selecting. So copy this block of code and we need to create 2 other options. Unemployed and student. You'll notice for checkboxes, we gave each checkbox a unique name. For radio buttons, we give all 3 radio buttons the same name, and this is known as a radio group, a radio button group. It makes sure that the user can only select one radio button out of that group. So now that we have our checkboxes and radio buttons created, we can save the file and preview it in our web browser. So that's what your form should look like up until this point. The last input field we want to create is the text area. The text area is similar to the input field, but it allows much more text to be inputted and across multiple lines. So let's take a look at an example. You'll notice if I copy and paste this over and over again, the text area allows for scroll bars, and we can also expand it and contract it. This makes it much more convenient for the user when it comes to inputting large amounts of text. So before we create the text field, we'll start with our label, which is additional comments. And in the column next to it, we'll input the text area. So to do that, we'll create the text area tag. And we'll explain what the attributes mean in just a moment. The open text area tag does require a closing text area tag. So as you can see, it includes the name attribute, just like all the other fields we created. It also allows you to specify the width of the text area, which is represented by cols, and the height specified by the number of rows. In this case, our text area will be 5 rows in height. Beyond 5 rows of text, the scroll bars will be enabled automatically. So let's save our file and take a look. So this is our text area here. And you can see that the scroll bars do activate. Now the last part of this form that we want to create is the submit and reset button. The submit button will submit the form data to our send.php script, or whichever file you've specified in the action attribute of your form. The reset button will empty the data inputted into the fields. And so that's how that works. So let's go ahead and create those 2 buttons. And we want to insert this in the second column on the 9th row, our last row. So the button is an input. We have to specify that the type, which is a submit button. We'll give it a name. We'll just call it submit. And a value. And then we just close the input. And we'll do the same for the reset button. I just capitalized the first letter. So let's go ahead and save the file and take a look at the entire form. Okay, so that's the entire form. You'll see we have the 2 text inputs. Our select menus are working. Our checkboxes. and the radio buttons, text area. And let's just test our reset button, so that works. Now the submit button will not work because we have not created the send.php file. Okay, that's the file that all this data will be transmitted to, and then that PHP file instructs our web server on what to do with the data. Is it going to be sent to a database, to an email address, or some other form of processing? We'll learn how to do that in the PHP part of this course.